All right, the recording has started, and this is the April 30th, 2019 Crossplane community meeting. And we will go ahead and get started by taking a look at the 0.3 milestone and some of the progress with our associated goals for that milestone. Running real-world applications and supporting Gitlab is one of the major tasks and themes of this milestone. So we have a particular or specific board tracking that progress as well. So let's go ahead and look at the project view. So we have a couple of tickets in review and in progress. It looks like this is not entirely up to date with some of the other issues that are being worked on right now or in review. I think, well, this one, the complex workloads, we can move into in review. Ilya, was there an issue on like both the GitLab controller implementation and then also the reconciler patterns that you worked on?
Yeah, I think it was, but I couldn't find it, so I didn't mark anything. I'll probably talk to Steve later on today. He probably knows better where to find it.
All right. Yeah, I believe it was this one here. So I'm going to go ahead and add that since you have a pull request out for it. I'm going to go ahead and add that into the project board and then
yeah, that one is specific one, and I don't think it's actually fixes the delay thing. I thought it was specifically tailored towards the implementing that delay in our reconciler controller. It mentions probably this design patterns document, but maybe.
Oh, and then this is a conversation from a pull request.
Yes.
Yeah, that conversation with the request, I think, was what triggered me bringing up Markdown again, just because I found that we had started discussing. I'd forgotten that that was all covered in the document already and started discussing it again.
It was a nice in-depth conversation, though. I appreciate it. Oh yeah, if we could find that issue, Ilya or Steve about the reconciler patterns, then let's go ahead and add that to the project board since we're currently working on it. Maybe it's linked from the pull request. No. Okay. All right, so let's just do a quick status update here then. So for extending Crossplane with new functionality for out of tree controllers and types and such, I've had a work in progress pull request for the design up for a little bit now, and I've gotten feedback from I think most everybody. I have not incorporated all that feedback into the document yet, but I have been working on the implementation that's kind of in agreement with the design as well as people's feedback, the direction that we've kind of been discussing in that design document. So I am moving ahead with both of those and trying to give as much attention and focus to implementing Crossplane extensions as my main priority right now in terms of development work on Crossplane. Nick, do you want to give us a quick update about complex workloads?
Yep, it's in review. For those who might not be familiar, complex workloads is functionality in Crossplane extending our existing that allows it to basically run arbitrary Kubernetes workloads, which is just arbitrary Kubernetes resource kinds on a Crossplane managed Kubernetes cluster. So the idea is you can say, hey, Crossplane, go and spin up a Kubernetes cluster somewhere for me, and then go deploy all of these things to it. A little bit like Federation. So the pull request got sent yesterday. Ilya has started reviewing it, and I'm in the process of fixing up some of the things that he found and replying to that. There is going to be potentially further work to do on it after this pull request is landed. The pull request adds sort of the core functionality, but there is one or two more things. Those things are validation webhooks. There are some cases in complex workloads where a Crossplane user could submit a complex workload CRD called a Kubernetes application that was fundamentally broken and would cause Crossplane to have a race against itself. Our plan to stop that happening is to use validation webhooks, but Crossplane does not use any validation webhooks yet, so that would be the first time introducing that pattern. So I've just deferred that from this pull request, and we can add it in a separate one later. The other thing that we need to look into is what was I calling them? Server populated immutable fields, such as the service cluster IP address. Basically, the way that complex workloads work is that we have a template for what I'm calling a template for a service or a deployment or whatever as part of the complex workload. Then we go and create that on a different cluster. With services, you create a service on the Kubernetes cluster, and then if it is type cluster IP or load balancer, that service's spec gets populated by another controller on that Kubernetes cluster with an IP address that then cannot be changed. So then we come back and we try and update it. And as part of that, we say, we don't have a cluster IP. And then it says, oh no, you can't change this field back to empty string because I set it to this specific thing. Then there's some further complications or reasons that it's more difficult than usual to do this for us, but I have some ideas about that. Anyway, long story short, complex workloads at the moment will create, update, and delete almost every Kubernetes resource type. The only times that things might get a bit wonky is updating things with immutable controller populated fields.
That's a great update, Nick. And then it's so obviously, continuing to drive that pull request and the feedback, from reviewers on it is going to be a priority. But I also liked the idea that I think you had yesterday about, trying to directly use these complex workloads that you've created and implemented to deploy Gitlab itself. So instead of going through a Gitlab controller, kind of validate them with the real use case and kind of work out maybe any obstacles or bumps that we encounter by trying to see Gitlab running directly using these the complex workloads. That sounded like a really good idea, I think.
Yeah, I'll probably like you say, I'll probably try and steward this pull request through first, and then Ilya mentioned that he has made some good progress towards something like what the sort of actual resources would look like for a complex workload that was GitLab. So I'll go and digest that and then try and translate it to a Kubernetes application.
Awesome. So that's a good segue for Ilya. Do you want to speak to the progress or any potential obstacles or blockers on the GitLab controller?
Well, GitLab controller itself, PR was submitted. I don't believe I got any feedback yet. So
was that for the types and the API,
yes,
or is that okay?
API design types and everything.
Got it.
I think Bassam mentioned initial feedback on the Google Doc, but after that was ported to the PR. I think it's been a little bit dormant, which is fine. I think we heads down on other stuff. So since right now we have forthcoming PR from Nick for actual implementation of complex workloads, I can start integrating GitLab, basically writing the complex workload types into the GitLab. On the front of the separating GitLabs into manageable workloads, into manageable sub-applications, there's also a PR going on there. I think, yes, there's PR branch in the GitLab experiments project, which we created to keep track of these artifacts. Again, I think we didn't have a chance to review it yet. So
I might have I might not be subscribed to that repo, Ilya, so I might not have seen a notification about that.
I think it was mentioned in the Slack channel a couple of times. I can send you a link.
Can you speak to like the purpose or scope of that particular repo? Like if
yes. So what that repo does, it takes the Helm chart generated from the official GitLab, I guess, repo recommendations, rendered into YAML file and separated into the, it's actually unbound, Jared.
Oh, okay.
Right, it generated and separated into separate application groups which required to install GitLab. Application generally characterized into broad categories of core and dependencies, with dependencies being external DNS, Let's Encrypt, possibly even Minia, and with core being all these internal GitLab components needed, like GitLab Minicore, Task Runner, Sidekick, secret generator, and so forth, so on. So that kind of gives us ability to manage and organize our workloads, and I think they should be probably represented as that granular as applications, so we can actually submit manageable workloads rather than one big application, which GitLab isn't. GitLab itself is a service which is composed of multiple applications. Yes, so that's the purpose of that repo. I think Nick started doing the work of simply doing proof of concept of running GitLab on AWS. I continued with doing on GCP and just took it a little bit further of stratifying it into the manageable components. As for the concerns about GitLab, there are few of them. Primarily, it will be very interesting to come up with the uniform deployment across multiple clouds. Specifically right now, we're dealing with the AWS and GCP. Azure yet to be tackled. We haven't done anything for Azure, even at the proof of concept level. And biggest challenge would be come up with the dependencies and workloads which are generic enough to be working on both cloud providers, the way we had examples with the with WordPress and workloads. That will be a biggest challenge. And the reason why, just to elaborate, because GitLab application or service itself is opinionated about cloud it's being installed on. There's actually hard if-else statements there, which is saying that if you run it in AWS, then you do this, or you need to have this dependency. If you run an in Google, you need to have this dependency in this format of secrets and so forth. So on.
Is that beyond the usage of object storage buckets?
Yes. Yes, it's also, it permeates into dependencies like ingress controllers, like external DNS and so forth. Ingress controller for GitLab initially was considered to be as a dependency. However, GitLab has specific requirements and they specifically kind of tailored ingress control for their need with the OpenTCP 22 port for SSH access. Hence, its already became not a requirement, it became core component. And that one itself also specific to a cloud provider. So when you deploy an ingress for GKE, it's one settings, one of options. When you deploy an ingress for AWS, it's another settings, another options.
So I have one comment. This is Jorge. So any Azure related questions or design, just feel free to reach out.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes,
on that design.
Azure being left out not by virtue of us not liking it, but rather than GitLab itself does not have a good story for Azure deployment in the Helm chart.
Yeah.
And but it was always an goal to do all three. So Azure should be followed very shortly.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for mentioning that, Jorge, and providing your expertise. That could very much come in handy. So we appreciate that a lot.
No problem.
All right. Yeah. So in terms of figuring out some of the more complicated portability aspects of GitLab, let us know if there's some things that we need to discuss or some input that you need to help figure out some of that stuff, Ilya.
Well, I think that they will become apparent, and we will need to solve them as we start writing the controllers for controller for GitLab to use and nix new complex workloads. So basically, that's what we're going to be facing face to face with these problems, and we need to solve them one way or another.
Got it. All right. Were there any particular issues besides the reconciler patterns that needs to be added to this project board? Were there any other particular issues that folks felt were missing from the 0.3 project board off the top of your head? There's probably a pass that we need to take here to cull some stuff that is out of scope, but if there's anything that anybody knows should be in this project board, then
what's our goal for delivering 0.3 again, like timeline wise?
So we had we had wanted to kind of try to stick to a cadence of around quarterly releases. And the 0.2 release was a little bit behind that. I think that was more like early April like early to mid-April, and it should have been like late March or mid-March. So we're a little bit behind that. I don't think we have a very clear date right now, Nick, for specifically when we're targeting 0.3. I think we need to do a little bit of thinking about that, and also a pass to scope some of the issues to be more in line with the theme and make sure that everything is, nice and tight in that milestone there. The big goals, like the theme of the milestone still very much remains the same of real world applications and support for GitLab. So I think, after we kind of pull some of that together, like have working more closer to finishing a more working functional GitLab support, then I think that it'll be an easier time to have the conversation of what are the gaps, what are some of the issues that we think are still critical to executing on the theme of the milestone, and try to nail down a release date. It's not going to be before KubeCon. I don't think we're not going to cut a 0.3 before that. But I think that my guess would be, sometime after that, we'll be able to narrow it down. And I'm thinking probably maybe we can get back to the quarterly schedule. And so maybe like the end of June might be the right time for that, or in June.
The reason I asked was that I've got to admit I haven't paid too close attention to what's in scope for 0.3 at the moment, but I recalled that it was I don't remember whether it was sort of supposed to have a focus on the real world applications, as you said, or whether it was more sort of production readiness, or at least doing some tech debt squashing.
Yeah, that kind of work is definitely not out of scope either. I think that that kind of, so a lot of that fits into running real world applications, as well as having some more production readiness type of attributes and behavior can go along with that as well. I think that that's going to, like, inherently that'll always have a nice long tail. So I'm thinking, as we go through future milestones, we're going to continue to have an emphasis on, production readiness and reliability and security and all that sort of stuff is going to continue through the next X amount of milestones.
Yeah, I do. Well, this is maybe getting a little bit off topic. I think there is a bit of a feeling that we might want to at some point dedicate some time to sort of tech debt squashing to get Crossplane to a point that it would be feasible for folks to actually start using it in anger, sort of in the real world. Mm-hmm. Maybe more so now than the regular level of maintenance that you would normally expect in a release cadence, sort of to increase production quality. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that, I'm not against that whatsoever. I think that, being able to have the right, patterns and the right level of quality and reliability, et cetera, in place to start, enabling more adoption is definitely something I'm supporting.
And I think there's an opportunity to talk about what, the roadmap for 0.3 and 0.4, and maybe that puts some of that, what Nick's talking about in perspective. So maybe we can, as an action item, let's maybe discuss the roadmap and then come back in the next community meeting with a proposal, or like a bit of a horizon here, 3.3, 0.4, maybe 0.5, while we're kind of hearing and what we're seeing and what we're wanting to do.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. All right. We also have a project board for GitLab support specifically. Nick, is this, I have a feeling this does not capture everything that is needed for GitLab. This might be a little stale that we need to add some more issues to.
That's likely. Yeah, I haven't double checked it recently. I've been moving some tickets through there, but
yeah, we talked through, I think, a lot of the issues that are related to here. So they're not on this board, but I think we've talked through them all so far.
yeah. I don't know if other people are finding value in that board or not at the moment. I could go either way. I'm happy to try and do a pass and make sure everything is on there that relates to GitLab. If there's any that I missed.
Yeah, I think it's still valuable to be able to see what's left and how we're converging for GitLab specifically. I think there's value in that. All right, so anything on milestones and upcoming milestones? I think we've pretty much covered most of the things that I would have expected to talk about there. All right. So we don't have to go into the full discussion here, but we can bring up a little bit about, we are currently on pull requests. We have two different code coverage checks, two different systems, Sonar and CodeCov. And, I wanted to see if there's any, what the opinions are of the two different systems, because they both have what appears to be slightly different ways of measuring the code coverage. So we don't have to go into the full, coverage gates for PRs and stuff like that, but just the general conversation between Sonar and CodeCov. Are there opinions forming on, solidly on which one is better, if we want to only use one of them, or how are people thinking about that?
I think that, as far as I can tell, CodeCov has what seems like a pretty obvious bug in that it complains about code coverage going down when you change non-code, when you change like Markdown and things like that. It'll complain that the code coverage is reduced, which seems counterintuitive.
And is that that still persists even after we made a change with the pull request like branches and what it's measuring from, et cetera?
I don't know.
It does. It's still.
Is that a well-known upstream thing that they're tracking, or is it just totally busted?
My opinion, the code coverage numbers always slightly off to some extent. But it becomes very apparent when you change the files which are not code related. Case in point, I created PR with the design doc for reconcile a pattern, and CodeCov complains about coverage going down, and some unrelated service Go file changed.
That you didn't even touch.
Yes, I suspect that the analysis is slightly behind, as Nick mentioned. Perhaps there's a bug how they detect the changes, because technically, it is obvious that the no-go files were changed. So the Git shots they comparing and run an analysis slightly off, or sometimes it's not even understandable where those Git shot comes from. So yeah, I had spotty understanding how the coverage with the CodeCov work. I think the interface itself is nice and intuitive. And when it works, it works. However, even on a good day, if I compare actually coverage numbers and try to understand where the percentage given coming from, it would be really hard to rationalize where does that 66% is coming from. Whereas on the flip side, where the Sonar gives you clear understanding, here's total number of lines, here's number of lines covered, here's miles to be covered. Overall, this is percentage, which is pretty straightforward.
And the Sonar numbers seem to be in line with our expectations. Like they seem to be accurate values.
Yeah, pretty much. I think overall, I would characterize the Sonar probably a little bit better coverage numbers. Tangentially to that, Sonar coverage analysis on CI side runs much faster. It's usually order of 10 to 15 seconds to submit the coverage report, whereas the code CAV takes sometimes up to 2 minutes to upload the coverage results. So I know it's totally irrelevant, but just I think it maybe speaks for the maturity of the platform itself. We can keep an eye on the code CAV, but for now I pretty much exclude. I'm not looking personally into code CAV numbers at all.
So it sounds like we might be at a point where, like I haven't heard anything where CodeCov wins really, and it sounds like it's not something we can really even trust because the numbers are unreliable. Are we at a point where we can remove support for CodeCov and just take a dependency on Sonar going forward, do you think, or are we not there yet?
I would personally like to get rid of CodeCov. This starts to diverge a little bit towards the whole opinions about GitLab gates and GitHub gates rather and things like that. So I won't go too much into it except to say that I personally have this thing where I find it really frustrating and confusing to see all of these like little red X's on GitHub PRs that don't actually mean that the PR is not ready to merge. So given that the majority of them are coming from CodeCov, and that CodeCov has different targets than Sonar, I would find it easier to rationalize the expectations if we just had one coverage target from one system, and it seems like Sonar is the better of the two options that we're trying at the moment.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me to have, like, if the numbers don't agree or the code coverage values are not in agreement, that using or looking at only one of them makes things more simple, obviously, and gives us less of a burden to have to kind of dig through values that we don't even necessarily have a trust in. And Ilya, I think you mentioned you kind of stopped looking at the code coverage numbers. So it seems like I'm not hearing a strong reason to keep CodeCov around at all. It seems like we could just punt it out and get rid of it.
I wouldn't mind, and I think kind of this was intent, I wouldn't say all along. Hence, maybe that's why the results were not, or checks were not required, because essentially we did not know beforehand what's the good platform to use. Granted that roughly 4 weeks ago, we had 0 coverage reports in the system in Crossplane. So this was something like evaluation period, and I think I'm comfortable of dismissing Git code CAV right now. But we can also keep an eye on it. Also, side effect of Sonar, it provides a little bit more than coverage reports. So whether there's values into looking into those, but
like code smells and stuff.
Code smells, code duplication, something like that.
Awesome. I think
they could be nuisances on their own, but nevertheless, they're there.
Yeah. I totally agree with you that, it was good to have, an evaluation period where we have both of them running and we could get a strong sense from experience to know which one will actually meet our needs better. So I totally think it was great to do that integration, and I appreciate that integration as well. So it sounds like we, unless anybody else on the call wants to speak up, it sounds like we have some agreement here that CodeCov can be removed. Alrighty. So I think that's the only topic we had here for the community topics. We had some conversations on the dev channel of the Slack workspace yesterday about logging and some improvements maybe to when running in debug to have to get rid of some of the distracting or misleading stack traces. So we've already had that discussion, so I don't think we need to have that again here. Were there any other community topics that anybody wanted to bring up before we move down to the PRs section?
If I may, I think when we talk about code coverage, I think the Sonar versus code CAV was part of the discussion, and I would think it's a smaller part. So I think Nick and I, we had the kind of conversation in the PR, and then we'll follow up in the email channel, which we can also move to PR. But overall, I think it boils down to kind of 2 points, in my opinion, and I think Nick agrees, is that understanding what the GitHub pull request checks are about and how we're supposed to treat them. And I think we'll also kind of have very similar understanding that normally if you have a check on your PR, those checks should pass. Hence, it will be nice to have the required checks if we truly care about quality of our PRs. So I think what Nick brought a good point, saying that it's super annoying to see a red X on the given check and yet still accept this PR as a valid PR. Hopefully by removing the offending at this point code cov, and we can get rid of some of these checks, but I think it brings the larger conversation topic. What is the take on the checks for the PR? And while I agree with Nick, I think it could be maybe at this early stage, sometimes we can adopt new check, which is we don't necessarily know whether or not we should make it required. And kind of, but by making it required, you kind of explicitly prevent PRs from being merged. So that's kind of, I want to, maybe people have different opinions to see what they think about non-required PR check.
I just like to, since I'm the one who sort of brought up this sort of optional thing, I think I provided a bunch of context to Ilya and Jared in a email that was internal to Upbound. So just to sort of to state my thoughts around this here in the sort of public forum. And this is definitely an area where I'm happy to be told that I'm just a crazy person and that no one else thinks this way. And so, but so I think about this from two perspectives. One is my project maintainer hat, and one is my potential contributor hat. And to me, it's not that I don't fundamentally like soft checks. This is more a complaint about GitHub's user experience around them, in that GitHub, like if GitHub gave you an orange thing or some different way to say that, like, if there was some easy way to say all of the required checks have passed and this not required check has not passed, then it would give a nice story to be like, okay, cool, my PR is now good enough to be reviewed and potentially merged, and it would be nice if this extra check passed, but it's not necessary. But as a reviewer, when you look at the list of pull requests in GitHub, there isn't a way to distinguish between a check failing that we don't really need to pass or a critical check failing. So as a reviewer, when I'm scanning through, and yeah, where Jared's going at the moment, I like to look for green ticks and think, aha, a green tick, this is ready for review. Like, it passes all the tests, it has coverage, it's the community member who submitted this has got it to a good place. But at the moment, a red X means that either it fundamentally needs more work because it doesn't pass critical checks, or it could be that it only has half the code coverage that we would like, and we'd be okay merging it anyway. And that's kind of something that I've noticed mostly while working as a maintainer on Crossplane, but I have previously noticed on other projects where I've been a newcomer to open source communities, that unless it's obviously documented somewhere, I can't tell easily as a contributor which checks the project maintainers expect me to make pass and which don't. So this has led to things before where I'll be adding a whole bunch of questionably useful tests to hit like a test coverage thing for some project, and then they'll be like, oh, we didn't actually care about that, but you didn't have any way of knowing that we didn't care about that. So I just think it gives people, it sets expectations much more clearly. If the mental model is, if there's a check, the check must pass.
I think I'm not muted now. I can weigh in on that as well. And you're thinking there, Nick, I do agree with. When you have a set of checks for a pull request, if one doesn't pass, and I don't think right now that there's any real way to make it, to have any indication of that failure not being important. There's really no facility or allowance for that. And so that makes a difficult situation, you know, as a contributor or even as a reviewer as well, of having to, you know, juggle in your head of, oh, okay, that red X is actually okay this time. You know, you don't really want to get into situations like that. So in general, I think that striving for, if it's a check on a pull request, then it's meaningful. That makes sense. If we remove CodeCov though, are we able to, like, do we have the other checks, you know, obviously like the integration test or unit test, like that has to pass, the DCO has to pass. That leaves us with Sonar. And, you know, are we at a point where, you know, Sonar is a hard pass or not? Because if we can get to a state where all checks must pass and that's just what it is, you know, green means yes, red means no. Or that's where I think that we would want to be. So would we be able to get to that?
I think we are. I think it's slightly, in my opinion, not the point. Yes, we want to have required checks and wanted them to be all green. No confusion there. I think, again, for the context, code coverage being a good example, which we start introducing and improving and evaluating for last 4 weeks. Hence, if we right off the front started with the required check, we would not be able to merge any of the PRs for last 4 weeks. Or not with override, right? So again, in ideal state, when project is mature, yes, all the checks should be required and we should be able to merge. In fact, if you open just one PR, early in my PR, you will see that there are checks there, which is, actually that's an example of, one patterns. You will see that slide above, add initial design document for example. Yeah, that one. So, and I think I can envision future contexts like that where we may want to add a check, which yet we may be not comfortable to become, yes, hardened and evaluated and saying, yes, that must pass. If we always assume that every check we introduce must be required, then yes, that's probably, and I'm kind of on the path with that too. I just think it's a little bit rigid, especially on the early phases like that, as I mentioned with code coverage.
I think I totally get the point. Like, you definitely don't want to just put a rule in place that you don't understand yet. And again, a lot of this is just me kind of complaining about the GitHub user experience rather than our decisions around it. I think one other option, though, is to, in the case of code coverage or something like that, is to potentially set up the test so that like we could basically turn on code coverage monitoring without actually setting a goal, right? So that we would see how much coverage we have and the test would pass, but it wouldn't actually be asking for any particular kind.
I think that's the second segue to that. I think the checks themselves are orthogonal to specific check. It could be other checks, not necessarily even related to code coverage.
Mm-hmm.
I think key takeaways that when you look at the GitHub top level, you're going to have this red X, which tells you nothing about what type of check is being violated until you open the PR and go into this level of view and expand it and then see, oh, I see check XYZ, which is not even required, failing. And then you can make informed decision whether or not you want to continue.
This is getting a bit deep into the weeds, but one thing I'm curious about, like when you get to this view as a contributor, is there any way to tell that we as maintainers do or do not make code cov pass? I don't know. I'm not sure about this. I tried to figure it out the other day, but I only looked for a second. I'm not sure if where it says like merging is blocked says something different, but I could definitely say that as someone who's used GitHub a little bit over the years, I've never noticed if there's an obvious way to tell.
So yes, and I think that's I guess clear with that. So we can decide whatever we want. And I think we converged that we, at this point for the Crossplane, removing code cov and making Sonar required check, we're kind of going to be in a good shape. Which brings us to the second point, which Nick just kind of give segue, is the coverage itself. So what I mentioned earlier, that particularly code cov or Sonar was not really a point. Point was one, checks, and second one is the coverage. And let me kind of a little bit quickly expand on that. So the Crossplane project is being generated by KubeBuilder model. We initially create the scaffolding for the projects, and it kind of has this two sets of files in it. You have initial scaffolding generated by KubeBuilder, which intended to be modified by users. And the second set of files, which is code generated files, which are not supposed to be modified by users since they've been regenerated every single time you do code gen. In our project today, we already exclude good set of files, which is specifically all the code gen files. We don't collect coverage on those. We exclude all test files. We exclude all test infrastructure, mocking, libraries files, and we also exclude some of the utility files, which also kind of test related. So it's already a good set of exclusions. So I guess the question then it boils down specifically to which user authored files do we think we should exclude or should not exclude? And Nick brought a good point saying that if I'm authoring, let's say, a file, which let's say create PR, which it requires kind of one code controller runtime related infrastructure, small file, which has no business logic per se, and I have two files, control and something else, which has heavy business logic. My controller runtime file complains about zero coverage and bringing my entire PR coverage down below the target rate. So the question is, can I exclude that file? And answer yes, you can totally exclude that file, and you can just add the properties in the GitHub repo, even have Sonar properties with the list of exclusions, and hey, specifically exclude this file from coverage collection. And that's understandable, you can do that, and then your coverage numbers go back up. Great, your PR is passing. Side effect of that is that this is the user authored file. And while today, right now, it doesn't have heavy business logic, nothing prevents next PR to add business logic to it in the package. Yet now that file completely excluded from the coverage, and yet there will be no indication that your coverage is being hammered, or if you have serious bugs in your code, or you're not addressing some testing. So that's why I kind of a little bit on the fence, and I think those cases needs to be handled on case-by-case basis. I'm not initially comfortable by default excluding. Specifically in this case, after played extensively with the Sonar and CodeCup, and just let me take beforehand, Go test coverage by itself does not provide any exclusions. In other words, unlike Go lint, you cannot simply say, annotate this function, do not lint. There's no analogy to that in Go test or Go cover. So this is handled at the level of the report. Now, when Sonar interprets this report, saying, what do you want me to do with this file? Or exclude it, good. So I played with it quite a bit, and I found that it's actually easier for me to, and frankly, arguably more beneficial to write simple test coverage, a test for that file, rather than figuring out how to efficiently and less error prone to exclude it. So that's kind of where I think misunderstanding and disagreement slightly happening, because while I do understand some files may not be require strong focus with coverage, I do think nevertheless, if you put tests for that and it's user authored file, no matter how little, there's still value in that test. Specifically, I made an example that that file itself, if you omit schema registration, you can actually break the build, or not build, but actually break the distribution. In fact, you can produce product which at runtime will fail. So I do think that we need to consider on case-by-case basis which files we exclude, just like we already do today with, I think, quite a big set of files.
Yeah, so I think maybe the direction of looking at excluding these files came because of the comment that I made about how I like the pattern about how the linter works. And I understand that you can't do that for code cov, but my code coverage in general, my thought pattern was I totally agree that we shouldn't be blanket excluding any sort of paths that, for the reasons you stated, there's, we could say that we won't test things under APIs, and then someone could go and add a reasonable amount of logic under there. I will preface all of this with I have a pretty good feeling that if we just get rid of code cov based on a very unscientific look last night, I don't think that there is actually that often. Like the majority of our pull requests do just end up having more than 80% code coverage on them anyway. It's only really pathological cases where like you add 2 lines and those 2 lines, one of them is covered, so you've got 50% coverage of your diff or something like that. So my thinking was mostly whether there was a better heuristic than N percentage of the diff to be targeting. So Sonar allows you to specify coverage in a couple of different ways based on like lines and branches and yada yada. And one of them is to target overall coverage of the project. So a pattern that I've seen in the past that I have liked does rely on it being somewhat of an honor system for users, but a pattern I've liked in the past is basically make sure that this pull request doesn't reduce the project's coverage overall, rather than say this pull request should have this much, and then it's kind of we just trust contributors to try to increase the test coverage to the extent necessary. And then we're kind of like, we say that if this doesn't decrease the coverage, then the pull request passes. But then I, as a reviewer, might be like, hey, you added 1,000 lines and you only have, 20% coverage. So I would prefer you to raise the coverage a little bit rather than saying coverage check fundamentally failed. But again, I really think that this is getting to the point that it would probably affect like 1 in 20 pull requests or something like that. So I don't know if we need to spend that much time optimizing. I would be pretty happy to make the coverage check required, make the sonar check required, that is, get rid of the code cov check, set the sonar check to 80% and just monitor it and see how often we come into cases where we're feeling like we would have to add tests to make this pass that we wouldn't otherwise add. I also think that like when you get into the whole, that specific example of like the APIs and workloads, the reason I sort of describe this as a philosophical thing is that different people have different approaches to testing, and none of them are few of them are fundamentally wrong in my opinion. So it starts to get towards person A and person B might disagree on a particular pull request, whether it warrants unit test coverage as opposed to end-to-end coverage or integration test coverage, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of gets pretty difficult to form a consensus there.
A point that I would like to make is that that Ilya had brought up as well is that there is definitely value in coverage for things that can catch integration type issues. Like it might be some like kind of generated code or boilerplate code, but if you don't, for the example there being, if you don't register your schema, then at runtime, you won't be able to, the controller won't be able to get your types. It might even crash, etc. So, being able to have some tests around that to make sure that it's properly registered, the whole full chain of schema registration is done there, which is in the API level. That's kind of reasonable to have as testing to make sure that, at runtime things won't completely blow up. And then another point is that a ton of other projects I've seen, the quality gate around code coverage for tests is around not reducing the coverage anymore. Like we get it to a certain level and then, no tests can bring it down anymore. So once you're at a certain level, you inherently have a coverage. You then begin to start having a coverage requirement of at a high level because you've already got the project to a certain level and you can't take it down anymore. So therefore you have to be at that high level with your new code as well. I'm okay though right now with like keeping the sonar check at a certain high percentage that's higher than the current repo wide level of coverage, and continuing to like see if that forces us to write tests that don't make sense, etc. But it seems like a lot of tests do make sense if they have integration implications. Ilya, did you have some final thoughts on that?
No, I think, I agree with what Nick said and what you just summarized with. I think just also to make sure that Nick's point was heard, that at current state of the project, we in general have very low coverage. So some tests are more important than another. So while all tests being created equal, some tests more equal than another. So we probably need to focus in generally, as Nick also mentioned earlier, to address technical debt, to bring overall project health to some reasonable state where we can now set the bar and do some kind of enforcement. Right now, it's kind of almost challenging to do that because I can touch the code with zero coverage, and now I'm holding the bucket to fix the right 80% of coverage just to get my PR through.
Yeah, I definitely feel like just to clarify on that point, because it's a good one. When Sonar does pull request coverage, let's say we have Sonar with this 80% target, does it look at 80% of the files that you touched, including what you didn't edit? I would really prefer it if it was possible for it to be like, oh, you added 10 lines and covered 8 of them rather than you added 10 lines to a 1,000-line file and you didn't go and add tests for the other 1,000 lines that were already there. That seems a little unfair to expect.
I didn't master Sonar to extend to answer off the tip right now, but from what I've seen so far, I've seen evidence of doing that. That while I'll be writing the line of the, or 2 in the file, and I'll get the error. Granted that maybe I not always wrote the test for that line or 2, so maybe that's why, I don't know.
So one thing that would...
Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to say one
5 minutes left too, so we have to start wrapping up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Final point that I'll make on this. I have some other feelings, but they can wait until a different forum.
Next 2 weeks.
Yeah. Final point that I'll make about that. What I was thinking about with like the linter setup, where like with you add like a no lint comment on a function. If there was a way for like a community, like so, one thing I saw the other day, for instance, was that tests coverage failed on a pull request that Ilya had, and Ilya put a comment on that pull request that explained why he wasn't going to add coverage very clearly. If there was some way for like a requirement that when you write a comment like that, the check went green and it's like, yes, you have now justified, there is a log, there is an artifact that's discoverable that we can go to figure out why we passed this pull request. That would be ideal. I'm not aware that that's actually a possibility, but that would be really nice in my opinion.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know. Also, I don't think that's entirely possible right now. And I agree, having some kind of common style cover skipping would be very nice. Like LinkedIn.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that either. So I don't think the tooling supports that. Or the ecosystem supports that, unfortunately. All right, so then it sounds like then we're going to remove CodeCov. We do think that quality gates on pull requests are important and they should be passing if they're implemented. So we shouldn't have red X's and have to know that, oh, that's an okay red X. That just causes lots of confusion that we want to avoid. And it sounds like then the code coverage gate then for Sonar, we're going to put that back to a high enough value for the new code being added in the request, in the pull request, and then see how that goes in the next few pull requests, and if that's causing us to implement tests that don't make any sense or we don't agree with, and continuing to monitor that. Is that about accurate for a summary?
Yep, that's my understanding too.
Alrighty, I'll add that to the as a note here as well. Okay, then, so I think we've talked about all these other pull requests except for Dan's validator pattern PR. Is this something you just opened recently, Daniel?
Yep, I just put it out there this morning. It's not ready at all. I just wanted to get kind of the concept out there so we could talk about it quickly in this call. But basically, so you may have seen in Slack, Jorge suggested validating the resource group names, and this could also extend to other resources within Azure using the ARM kind of API. So you submit a deployment to, and it basically validates it. So the issue with that is the way that kind of our newer resources are structured is that they kind of wrap a Azure API in their Go library. So you can't actually, for instance, I think in here somewhere, so it has like Azure Resource Group, and we have a client there, which is the groups client. Well, it's actually using a different client if you want to use the ARM validation. So my kind of idea for that was to have a client component of Azure Resource Group and then kind of a validator component. And I just want to get some feedback on that, if people thought that was a good idea, or if there was kind of a better way to do it. When verifying a deployment, you kind of, let's say we're just checking the resource group name, it would kind of have to pass in a dummy valid deployment. And then it would not be failing because the deployment wasn't valid. It would just be because the resource group name.
Daniel, is a quick question. If validation happens in terms of uniqueness of resource group, or in terms of like, valid naming format, like length and characters?
Allowed values.
Yeah, it would just be, I think, allowed values, I'm pretty sure. If you see in the, I guess it's in the client in the client, I believe that it checks the resource group name for kind of a regex pattern that Azure has on the website. So kind of instead of that, we'd want to move to something where we're actually asking Azure instead of having it hard coded in there. So that's kind of the idea behind that. I think that's why Jorge brought that up.
And is this client specifically for resource group, or it also can be used for other resources in Azure?
It can be used for other ones. It's called the deployments client. So basically you just pass it. I think it's like a name and location, and then it's kind of like, like Terraform or something like that, or CloudFormation. It's just their kind of templates for deploying resources. So it's validating one of those. So
I see. So I think it's maybe judgmental for us.
Validate just the group name, but it is a little more dynamic.
I think I came across when I wrote the storage account, similar thing is that when basically storage account actually has a uniqueness validation on that. So it must not collide with any other storage account in the universe when you create one, just like Bucket and I guess in Google. So I think it's fine to have the separate client and perhaps create that and reference to it from the resource clients. There could be good value in it. So just kind of, I'm not opposed to adding that. I understand also the now infrastructure complexity. Now in your reconciler, you need to, instead of creating one client, you can now either create two clients or perhaps create one client which wraps both now your resource client and validation client.
Right.
I'm open to that, and just as long as it's done kind of in a convenient way, there could be value in it. But I also see in the same time, maybe not necessarily being super pressing on that. Again, the worst comes to worst, even you provide totally invalid name, your provisioning going to fail, right? So you're going to complain. Yes, it's less than ideal, but I would not say it's critical priority for us right now.
Right.
Yeah, Dan. The two things I would add here is that if the Azure API underneath requires a different type of client to do validation checks, then that's fine. We can create the two different clients and use them to perform the work. One of validating and the second of provisioning or deploying. If they're two different clients for that, that's okay, no problem. And then the important thing for me too is that from the experience perspective, both from the user's experience perspective, and then also another experience to take into account is the developer's experience. So from the user's perspective, if they create a resource in Azure that's no good, are they going to get the right information they need to fix that? Like upfront early validation before we create some resource with Azure that has to get cleaned up later. Is the error message clear? Like this field is this value, but it needs to be these values. That type of experience is really the overall goal here. Will our users, if they make a mistake, be able to clearly understand what they have to change, or can we even change it automatically? Is there any automation logic that we can make reasonable changes without changing the user's intent? Obviously, if we can do that, that's great. And then the developer experience is also important as well. Of if we can wrap this validator client so that we don't, like when we invoke the API, and we'd have to think about it, when we invoke the API to create or to validate, that it's that's not like managing that extra client doesn't become super burdensome. Then that's a goal, but that would require some thought, and it's not necessarily black and white.
Okay, awesome.
But I think the direction here isn't totally wrong. Of having a separate client that does the validation work. If that's what the Azure API requires, then that's okay. That's what the Azure API requires.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, so we are out of time. And I think that was the last item here. So thank you very much today, guys, for the fruitful discussion on our pull requests and milestones, et cetera. So we're going to keep executing on real world applications, GitLab support, et cetera. And we will also be thinking about, I think everyone can do this, be thinking about the roadmap and some of the goals for the upcoming milestones, and what we want to put priorities on, production readiness and technical debt and feature support and all that sort of stuff. And we will circle back about that soon. But the near term priority, like this week and next week, is continuing executing on GitLab support. All right. All right. So yeah, that's all for this meeting. So thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate it.